Throughout the past 3 days, various issues regarding agriculture, bio, and climate change have been addressed at this year's G7 summit. But we're still expecting many critical talks to take place. One of those will be a meeting between the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and the United States. For more on this, we're going to hear from Dr. David Tizzard, professor of Korean Studies from Seoul Women's University. Welcome, Dr. Tizzard.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
All right. Now, the last trilateral meeting between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan happened back in Cambodia. At the time, they discussed the need for stronger economic cooperation and security alliances against Pyongyang's nuclear threat. So what can we expect from a relatively short sideline talks later in the afternoon?
I think we can expect more of the same that we have. We can expect the good times to continue rolling between Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington. President Yoon, President Biden, and Prime Minister Kishida, they seem to be enjoying good relations with each other. And I think it's quite a boon for South Korea that despite the G7 taking place in Japan, and despite not being a member, President Yoon seems to be playing not a pivotal role, but he seems to be playing a role that is recognized by the world's press. He's there. He's meeting with various people, both publicly and behind closed doors. So we can expect to see more of this. In your previous segments, you had President Yoon addressing things like climate change and food shortages and things like this. These are very, very important, but they're also rather non-controversial. These are things that all countries around the world can more or less agree on them. When it comes down to what we're seeing with G7 at the moment, we're seeing a division of the world in some parts, or at least a possibility. We know that Chairman Xi Jinping in China is meeting with his friends there. And so we're getting this division on terms of values, on terms of democracy and economic cooperation. To me, it's very interesting that previously in the Cold War, we used to imagine that the West was the one that would give economic grants and support and not worry too much about ideology. It was about a free market and open societies, and the East and China were very concerned with ideology. That seems to have been switching at the moment. China is providing economic assistance to various countries around the world, sometimes no questions asked, whereas in the G7, there is a focus on values, on democracy, on open society, and on what they perceive as, what is perceived as global security. And President Yoon for South Korea is part of that. He's decided to go there. Unlike his predecessor, he's not going to Pyongyang and meeting with Chairman Kim Jong-un. And so this is a big moment, I believe, for South Korea.
Right, a new world order, especially with flaring geopolitical tensions around the world. But now let's shift focus to Korea and Japan relations. President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida went to a memorial park honoring the Korean victims of the atomic bombing in 1945. Now, they both honored it, and it was the first time a Korean president ever did so. But what would you read into this? What's the significance behind this gesture?
Seoul and Tokyo are coming together closer than they have been in a long time. And this is part of President Yoon's policy. And it was part of what he campaigned on. He wanted to bring Seoul and Tokyo back together. Now, as they do this, because of historical antagonisms, because of the reality of what has gone on in the past, there is a need sometimes, I think it's inappropriate to call it soft power or window dressing or messages, but both of these leaders have made a point of going to various places of historical memory in both South Korea and Japan and paying their respects. So as they are moving forward with their relationships with each other, they're showing the public, they're showing the people of both South Korea and Japan, we are conscious of history. We know what has gone on before in the past. To me, it's interesting that some people will often look at South Korean politics and they will view it through the lens of their own country. So they might say, well, these are the conservatives and these are the Democrats. But rather than on cultural issues, one of the big dividing lines in South Korean politics is Japan or Pyongyang, and how is that navigated? The conservatives in South Korea generally tend towards Tokyo and Washington, whereas the left, they might favor engagement with Pyongyang. So President Yoon is doing that, and he's continuing with it. They're being conscious of history while still trying to move forward and address what I think they're calling strategic cooperation in the face of shared challenges.
Right. Speaking of strategic cooperation and historical issues, would you evaluate President Yoon's stance with Tokyo to be very strategic, putting history in the past and trying to evolve for future relations?
Well, let's give this idea while we're here. We could call President Yoon's current policy progressive.
All right.
Now, that's not a word that you will often hear associated with President Yoon, certainly domestically. And I'm not talking about the Ministry of Gender and Equality here or any domestic issues. I'm talking about on the global stage, where does South Korea position itself? Where does it stand and who does it stand with?
Right.
President Yoon has put his colours firmly to the mast here, it seems, and it will be interesting to see what statements come out. But siding with Washington and Tokyo, going towards open society, going towards democracy, this is a big move. And there might be some analysts that say that's the old order, and the new world order might be coming from the developing world. It might be coming from Brazil and India. And is President Yoon making the right strategic decision? It seems that he's making a value-led decision. Whether it strategically plays out correctly in the future, only those with crystal balls will know. But it seems that these values are what are driving them that way, and Washington and Tokyo and many others, including the United Kingdom, seem happy to reciprocate.
All right, and as you said, Washington is very happy with South Korea's stance on what's happening in the global world. But I feel as a middle power, South Korea needs to be a little bit more careful as to how it plans it out and how it, acts in the global front. So how would you evaluate South Korea's efforts so far?
I would applaud them. South Korea was a nation that was mired by poverty, colonialism, imperialism, civil war, and it's grown into this cultural, political, and economic behemoth. It stands very proudly, and now it's there. It has to address, does it have a duty to reciprocate in the aid and the assistance that helped it to get where it is today? That's a big challenge for South Korea, and it certainly won't come easy, but I think it's more than capable of doing things like that.
But it should definitely consider other partner countries like China, Russia, with the ongoing Ukrainian war. And another key country that it always has to keep on mind is North Korea.
Certainly.
Pyongyang is always the problem in between what South Korea does in the international arena. So especially with South Korea, the United States, and Japan being stronger together in ties, that could impact our security alliance with North Korea as well. So how would you read into this?
I would start by looking at the concept of democracy. Now, one of democracy's greatest strengths is that you've seen President Yoon singing in the White House, you've seen the bonhomie, you've seen the good times and the feelings between these leaders. And that's a beautiful thing because people come across from different cultures, different parts of the world, different religions, and they find shared values, and that's what democracy is good at. Here's where democracy can sometimes be weak, in that in 2024, there's another US presidential election. President Yoon can only serve one term here. Chairman Xi Jinping will likely be in power for a long time. Chairman Kim Jong-un will likely be in power for a long time, and President Putin in Russia. Other situations permitting, and health and things like that, this could all change in a matter of a year. And if, for example, if President Trump takes the White House or somebody else does, we honestly don't know. We cannot predict these things. That's where this can be rather difficult for South Korea to navigate, because while you have some kind of stability or the ability to forecast what certain nations will be doing in the future strategically, it's very hard to say what Seoul will be doing in the next presidential election, and Washington and France and the United Kingdom and all around the world. So that's the strength and the weakness of democracy that South Korea is trying to navigate. For sure. And why don't we move on? I would like to ask you what you think about middle powers joining these types of events like the G7 summit. It's a very big global front where they can talk with different leaders. But we're also going to be seeing South Korean president meet with Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky. What do you expect to be discussed there? I expect the photo ops to be very good. I'm not sure whether President Yoon can come out and make a bold statement will be very interesting. In terms of middle power, in terms of what South Korea can do here, I'll probably make two very brief points. The first one is, you don't ask to be a member of an elite club. You wait until they ask you. That's how these things work. It doesn't pay to go knocking on doors and say, please let me in. I think South Korea is conscious of that, and it's not going to be making any moves to make it a G8, at least publicly, especially with other big contenders. The other thing certainly might be this, that President Yoon, he has a lot to do here. And yeah, well, let's see what goes on with President Zelensky.
All right, and last but not least, as I mentioned before, we're seeing much more countries join this G7 summit. We've seen the headcount double, actually. What do you think about more middle power countries joining major international events like the G7 summit?
Okay, let's see if I can remember the second point this time. The more, a fact of geopolitics is that the more members that join, it dilutes the quality. That's just simply what happens. The more members you have, the harder it is to negotiate and get things done. On the other hand, you could say this, that the G7 is currently very North Atlantic, it's very Anglo-Saxon, it's very wide apart from Japan. And this is a very important region of the world. So South Korea does have an argument to make that we can shift this pivot over here. And it's a reasonable argument, yes.
And one last question I have for you, actually, is what the general public is talking about. What are they most interested about South Korea's stance in the G7 summit?
There is no general public, I say that, because a lot of the South Korean left will be up in arms about what's going on. And just in the same way, the South Korean right will be supporting and applauding that. And internationally, there will be people looking at this as well. In Tokyo, in Japan, there are people protesting what's going on. They're not happy that President Biden is in Hiroshima, where the United States dropped bomb. On the other hand, there are people supporting it. So it's very divisive, and that's why I think we see a lot of behind-the-scenes talks, as well as a lot of things played for the media, these visits to certain places so they can get this message across and try to move forward. I think deep down, we all know what Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington want in the current administrations. It's whether they can convince their various publics that that's the way forward. And again, that's democracy, that's diplomacy, and we'll see what skills they have in trying to achieve their aims.
And hopefully today we'll see the main agenda being peace and stability actually covered in all these talks.
We will, but it will only be unilateral message. It will be one part of the world talking to themselves and sending their message over. It won't be people sitting down together with their antagonistic partners. And that's the next challenge, and that's why we do see the divide here. And perhaps going forward, this is the start of where we might be bringing these things together, but the message at the moment is still, let's say, unilateral.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Tizzard.
Thank you.